I didn't expect my cousin's wedding to become the moment my past came back to hunt me. I thought it would be laughter, champagne glasses clinking, soft music drifting through a country club ballroom. I thought it would be about love, family, and finally celebrating someone else's happiness without carrying old scars into the room. I was wrong. The first sign something was off wasn't dramatic. It was a tightening in my chest. A strange, familiar dread that crawled up my spine the second I saw him standing at the altar, dressed in a tailored tuxedo, smiling like he belonged there. Brian, the man who made 2 years of my teenage life feel like a daily survival test. The man who followed me through hallways, knocked my books out of my hands, laughed while his friends joined in, and once pinned me in an empty classroom just to remind me how powerless I was. And there he was, my cousin's wedding guest. No warning, no preparation, just my bully, standing confidently as if he had every right to exist in my space again. My hands were shaking as I held my bouquet. I told myself to breathe, to stay quiet, to get through the ceremony and leave without causing a scene. But silence has a cost. During the reception, while fairy lights glowed overhead and people toasted love, Brian walked up to me like we were old friends. He asked if I wanted a drink. He smiled and said, "It's been forever. We should catch up." Something inside me snapped. Years of swallowed fear, years of pretending I was over it, years of being told high school didn't matter anymore. I told him the truth, out loud, in front of everyone who mattered. I told him exactly who he was. The music didn't stop, but the room did. Conversations froze. Faces turned toward me. My cousin stared in shock. Her husband looked furious, not at Brian, but at me. And that was when I realized something worse than seeing my bully again. By speaking up, I hadn't just exposed my past. I had started something I couldn't undo, because now people were choosing sides. And within days, the messages started coming. Threats, insults, warnings telling me I should have kept my mouth shut. Standing there in that ballroom, I thought I was finally taking my power back. I didn't know it would cost me my family's peace or my own sense of safety. I'm Fiona. I'm 26. The kind of person who plans lessons weeks in advance, color codes sticky notes, and keeps extra pencils in her desk drawer because I can't stand the idea of a child feeling unprepared. I teach 5th grade in the suburbs of Columbus, and most days my world is small in the best way. Spelling tests, recess drama, children who still believe adults can fix things. That life didn't come from nowhere. It came from running. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone, where gossip moved faster than weather. People smiled in public and judged in private. The kind of place where if you became the weird girl or the easy target, that label clung to you like smoke. In 10th grade, I became a target. Brian was 2 years older than me, taller, louder, surrounded by friends who laughed at the right moments like a trained audience. I still remember the first time he singled me out in the hallway. It wasn't even something clever. It was just a comment about my clothes, his voice cutting through the crowd like he owned the air around him. I laughed nervously like it didn't matter. That was mistake number 1. After that, it was like he turned it into a hobby. He would appear outside my classes as if he'd been waiting for me. He'd drift behind me in the hallway, close enough that I could feel him without even turning around. Sometimes he'd knock my books out of my hands and stare while I scrambled to pick them up, my cheeks burning as other students stepped around me like I was invisible. The worst part wasn't even Brian. It was how easy it was for everyone else to pretend it wasn't happening. A teacher would glance over, see a crowd, hear a laugh, and keep walking. A hallway monitor would tell us to move along. The school had posters about anti-bullying and a zero-tolerance policy, but the reality was simple. Brian knew how to hide his cruelty when adults were close. I didn't. At home, my family was already carrying too much. My dad worked 2 jobs to keep up with the mortgage, and my mom was dealing with medical bills after being diagnosed with diabetes. Money was tight in the way you could feel in the quiet after dinner, when the dishes were done and the adults thought the kids couldn't hear them whispering about numbers. They wanted to transfer me to a private Catholic school across town. We couldn't afford it. So I stayed. I adapted. I learned how to become smaller. I ate lunch in the library. I memorized alternate routes between classes. I learned which bathrooms were usually empty. I practiced holding my face neutral so no one could see how much I was shaking inside. And even then, Brian found ways. There's one memory that still comes back without warning, like my body stored it in a place my mind doesn't control. The chemistry lab. After school. The building half empty. The air smelling faintly of cleaning solution and stale paper. I'd stayed late to make up a test because I'd pretended to be sick just to avoid the day. I was packing my bag when I heard the door click shut behind me. Brian's voice was casual, almost bored, like he'd just wandered in by accident. He insulted me the way he always did. Then he grabbed my backpack and dumped everything on the floor. Papers, notebooks, pencils scattering like someone had shaken me open. When I knelt to pick it up, he stepped on my hand. Hard. I remember the shock more than the pain. The way my breath caught, the way my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. The scrape on my knuckle burned for days. It left a small scar I can still see if I look closely enough. That night, I told my parents everything. My dad's face went tight with fury, like he wanted to drive straight to Brian's house. My mom stopped him. Not because she didn't believe me, but because she was scared of making it worse. Instead, we met with the principal, Mr. Davidson. He nodded. He promised to handle it. He probably did call Brian into his office. It changed nothing. If anything, Brian came back sharper, like being confronted had only made him more interested in proving he could get away with it. The bullying continued until he graduated, and when he finally left, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Senior year, I made friends. I joined drama club. I went to prom. I started to believe I could become someone else, someone who wasn't always bracing for impact. After graduation, I chose Ohio State partly because it was a good school, and partly because it was 3 hours away. Far enough that the pass couldn't reach me. That was the plan. And it worked. Until my cousin's wedding brought Brian right back into my life, dressed like a celebration, smiling like he'd never hurt anyone in his life. College was supposed to be my clean slate. At Ohio State, I learned what it felt like to exist without constantly checking over my shoulder. The campus was huge, anonymous in the best way. No one knew my history. No one knew my fear. I could walk across the oval with my head up and not feel like I was walking into a trap. I studied education because I wanted to be the kind of adult I never had when I needed one most. I wanted to notice the quiet kids, the ones who ate lunch alone, the ones who learned how to disappear. I built a life that felt solid. I met Jake during my sophomore year. He was kind in the unassuming way, steady, patient, never raising his voice, never making me feel small. We've been together for 4 years now. When I told him about Brian, years later, he didn't interrupt. He didn't minimize it. He just listened, his jaw tight, his hand wrapped around mine like he was anchoring me to the present. After graduation, I moved to Columbus and started teaching. I rarely went back to my hometown. My parents eventually moved to Florida for my dad's retirement, and the last thread tying me to that place quietly loosened. Or at least I thought it had. When my cousin Lizzie asked me to be a bridesmaid, I said yes without hesitation. Lizzie is 5 years older than me. Growing up, she was the cool, older cousin who let me sit in her room and talk about things I didn't feel safe saying anywhere else. She knew about Brian. I'd told her during one of our summer visits years ago, my voice low, like saying his name too loudly might summon him. She believed me. So when I arrived early for the rehearsal dinner, I felt safe. The weekend felt warm and familiar. Family laughter, inside jokes, shared memories. Lizzie looked genuinely happy, calm in the way only someone truly in love can be. Tom, her fiancé, seemed solid. A mechanic who owned his own shop, hands always stained with grease, laugh loud and easy. Everyone liked him. He hugged me like family and thanked me for being there for Lizzie. Nothing felt wrong. Not on Friday, not Saturday morning as we got ready together, curling hair and adjusting dresses, not even as we lined up for the ceremony. Then the groomsmen started walking down the aisle. I was standing at the front, bouquet in my hands, when I saw him. At first, my brain refused to cooperate. It offered excuses. You're imagining it. He just looks similar. You're being paranoid. But fear has a memory sharper than logic. The way he stood, the slight tilt of his head, that familiar, smug confidence like he owned every room he entered. Brian. My heart started pounding so hard I thought other people could hear it. My palms went damp around the stems of the flowers. I forced myself to keep my face still because the music was playing and the doors were opening, and this was Lizzie's moment. I couldn't ruin it. I told myself that over and over. Don't make this about you. Don't panic. Just get through it. During the vows, I barely heard a word. I caught Brian looking toward me once, just a flicker of recognition in his eyes before he looked away. He knew. At the cocktail hour, I stayed close to the other bridesmaids, keeping my smile practiced and polite. I laughed at the right moments. I posed for photos. I avoided the bar where the groomsmen clustered. But weddings are designed to bring people together. Paths cross, circles overlap. There was no escaping him forever. When I felt someone step up behind me at the bar, I already knew who it was before he said my name. His voice hadn't changed. That casual tone, that assumption of familiarity. He smiled like we shared a secret history, like the years he terrorized me were just a quirky footnote. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just easy conversation, as if we'd simply lost touch. And in that moment, something old and heavy shifted inside me. Because Brian wasn't just pretending nothing happened. He was testing me, testing whether I'd stay silent, testing whether I'd still be the girl who swallowed her pain to keep the peace. And I realized then that the real conflict wasn't seeing my bully again. It was deciding whether I would let him rewrite the past by acting like it never mattered. College was supposed to be my clean slate. At Ohio State, I learned what it felt like to exist without constantly checking over my shoulder. The campus was huge, anonymous in the best way. No one knew my history. No one knew my fear. I could walk across the oval with my head up and not feel like I was walking into a trap. I studied education because I wanted to be the kind of adult I never had when I needed one most. I wanted to notice the quiet kids, the ones who ate lunch alone, the ones who learned how to disappear. I built a life that felt solid. I met Jake during my sophomore year. He was kind in the unassuming way, steady, patient, never raising his voice, never making me feel small. We've been together for 4 years now. When I told him about Brian, years later, he didn't interrupt. He didn't minimize it. He just listened, his jaw tight, his hand wrapped around mine like he was anchoring me to the present. After graduation, I moved to Columbus and started teaching. I rarely went back to my hometown. My parents eventually moved to Florida for my dad's retirement, and the last thread tying me to that place quietly loosened. Or at least I thought it had. When my cousin Lizzie asked me to be a bridesmaid, I said yes without hesitation. Lizzie is 5 years older than me. Growing up, she was the cool, older cousin who let me sit in her room and talk about things I didn't feel safe saying anywhere else. She knew about Brian. I'd told her during one of our summer visits years ago, my voice low, like saying his name too loudly might summon him. She believed me. So when I arrived early for the rehearsal dinner, I felt safe. The weekend felt warm and familiar. Family laughter, inside jokes, shared memories. Lizzie looked genuinely happy, calm in the way only someone truly in love can be. Tom, her fiancé, seemed solid. A mechanic who owned his own shop, hands always stained with grease, laugh loud and easy. Everyone liked him. He hugged me like family and thanked me for being there for Lizzie. Nothing felt wrong. Not on Friday, not Saturday morning as we got ready together, curling hair and adjusting dresses, not even as we lined up for the ceremony. Then the groomsmen started walking down the aisle. I was standing at the front, bouquet in my hands, when I saw him. At first, my brain refused to cooperate. It offered excuses. You're imagining it. He just looks similar. You're being paranoid. But fear has a memory sharper than logic. The way he stood, the slight tilt of his head, that familiar smug confidence like he owned every room he entered. Brian. My heart started pounding so hard I thought other people could hear it. My palms went damp around the stems of the flowers. I forced myself to keep my face still because the music was playing and the doors were opening, and this was Lizzie's moment. I couldn't ruin it. I told myself that over and over. Don't make this about you. Don't panic. Just get through it. During the vows, I barely heard a word. I caught Brian looking toward me once, just a flicker of recognition in his eyes before he looked away. He knew. At the cocktail hour, I stayed close to the other bridesmaids, keeping my smile practiced and polite. I laughed at the right moments. I posed for photos. I avoided the bar where the groomsmen clustered. But weddings are designed to bring people together. Paths cross. Circles overlap. There was no escaping him forever. When I felt someone step up behind me at the bar, I already knew who it was before he said my name. His voice hadn't changed. That casual tone, that assumption of familiarity. He smiled like we shared a secret history, like the years he terrorized me were just a quirky footnote. No apology, no acknowledgement, just easy conversation, as if we'd simply lost touch. And in that moment, something old and heavy shifted inside me. Because Brian wasn't just pretending nothing happened. He was testing me, testing whether I'd stay silent, testing whether I'd still be the girl who swallowed her pain to keep the peace. And I realized then that the real conflict wasn't seeing my bully again. It was deciding whether I would let him rewrite the past by acting like it never mattered. The drive back to Columbus felt endless. The highway was dark and mostly empty. my headlights cutting through the night while my mind replayed the wedding over and over like a scene I couldn't turn off. Every few miles, I caught myself gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my shoulders aching from the tension I hadn't realized I was holding. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, it was after midnight. Jake was waiting up for me. He was sitting on the couch, the TV on, but muted, his phone in his hand like he'd been checking it every few minutes. When I opened the door, he stood immediately. "You're home early," he said, concern already in his voice. I dropped my purse on the counter and sank into a chair. The words didn't come right away. My throat felt thick, like everything I'd held back was pressing against it at once. "He was there," I finally said. "Brian." Jake's expression changed instantly. "At the wedding?" he asked. I nodded. "Best man." I told him everything. Seeing Brian at the altar, the bar conversation, the dance, the way Tom looked at me like I was exaggerating something I'd lived through. I told him about leaving, about the parking lot, about the drive home with my heart still racing. Jake listened without interrupting. When I finished, he crouched in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. "You set a boundary. That's it." I wanted to believe him, but the next morning, the doubt crept in. Lizzie didn't call. Tom didn't message. The family group chat was quiet in a way that felt heavy, not peaceful. I started questioning myself in the worst ways. Should I have waited until after the wedding? Should I have said nothing and dealt with it privately later? Did I ruin her day? I tried to remind myself that I hadn't planned this, that I hadn't sought Brian out, that all I'd done was refuse to pretend. But guilt is persuasive when it wears the face of family. 2 days later, Lizzie finally called. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice tired. "I'm so sorry, Fiona. I should have handled things better." Relief washed through me, followed quickly by hesitation. "What did Tom say?" I asked. There was a pause. "He was defensive," she admitted. "Brian helped him through his divorce, through the custody stuff with his ex. He sees him as loyal, as someone who's always had his back." I closed my eyes. "So he doesn't believe me," I said. "It's not that simple," Lizzie said quickly. "He believes you felt hurt. He's just struggling to connect that with the person he knows." The words stung anyway. Lizzie asked if I'd be willing to talk to Tom directly, to explain everything again, in detail, when emotions weren't so high. She said she thought it might help him understand. I hesitated. The thought of laying out my trauma again, of defending my own memories, made my stomach twist. But Lizzie was my family, and part of me wanted closure, wanted someone on Tom's side to finally say, "I believe you." So I agreed. We scheduled a video call for the following weekend. When Tom appeared on the screen, he looked uncomfortable, but at least attentive. He apologized for how he'd reacted at the wedding. He said he'd been caught off guard and hadn't handled it well. That was something. I told him the stories again, slowly this time. The hallway harassment, the chemistry lab, the scar on my hand. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't exaggerate. I just told the truth the way I remembered it. Tom listened. He asked questions, real ones. "How old were you? How long did it go on? Did anyone ever step in?" When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "That's not normal," he said finally. "That's not just kids being kids." I felt something loosen in my chest. Tom admitted that Brian had mentioned having regrets about high school before, but had never been specific. Tom said he'd assumed it was normal teenage stuff. Being insensitive, maybe teasing people who didn't fit in. "I never imagined it was like this," he said. For the first time since the wedding, I felt heard. But what I didn't know then was that while we were having that conversation, careful, measured, honest, Brian was already doing what he'd always done best, twisting the story, planting doubt, and preparing to turn people against me all over again. The shift didn't happen all at once. At first, it was subtle, small comments, awkward pauses, the kind of tension you feel before anyone admits there's a problem. Lizzie would text me saying Tom was thinking things through. Tom would ask for clarifications that felt less like curiosity and more like he was building a timeline in his head. Then Brian reacted. It started with Tom confronting him. They met at their usual bar after work, the same place they'd celebrated promotions and bad weeks and survived Tom's divorce together. Tom told me later that Brian laughed when he brought me up, actually laughed, and said high school kids were cruel to each other, that everyone teased everyone, that I was being overly sensitive about ancient history. He said maybe you had a crush on him, Tom told me over the phone, his voice tight, and that you were still bitter he never asked you out. The words felt like a punch to the stomach, not because they hurt, but because they were so familiar. That was Brian's pattern. Dismiss. minimize, reframe the victim as obsessed. Tom said he'd pushed back, told Brian what I'd described wasn't harmless teasing. Brian shrugged it off, joked that women love to rewrite the past when they don't get their way. That was when Tom started to see it. Not all at once, but enough to unsettle him. A few days later, Lizzie called me again. She sounded shaken. "Brian's been talking," she said, "to Tom's friends, to people in their circle." My stomach dropped. Brian had been telling people I was a drama queen, that I'd ruined a wedding because I couldn't let go of teenage grudges, that I was unstable, jealous, attention-seeking. He framed it like concern, like he was worried about Tom marrying into a family that caused problems. It was high school all over again. The whispers, the side glances, the way he positioned himself as calm and reasonable while painting me as irrational. Tom was furious when he found out. What finally cracked something open for him wasn't just Brian's past. It was Brian's present behavior. Tom started noticing things he'd ignored before. The way Brian talked about women. The way he dismissed people who disagreed with him. The way he seemed to enjoy creating conflict and then stepping back to watch it unfold. They argued again, this time worse. Brian told Tom he needed to choose, his loyal friend or his new wife's crazy family. That was the moment Tom said their friendship was over. Brian didn't take it well. He sent Tom a series of angry messages that night, long, unfiltered, vicious. He called Tom weak, said he was whipped, said he'd regret throwing away a real friend for emotional women who played victim. Lizzie sent me screenshots. Reading them made my hands shake. The language was cruel and misogynistic. The same tone I remembered from high school, the same entitlement, the same rage at losing control. And then something unexpected happened. Brian's ex-wife reached out. Her name was Elena. She contacted Tom first, saying she'd heard about the situation through mutual connections and felt compelled to share her experience. When Lizzie told me about the call, my chest tightened with dread and validation at the same time. Elena had been married to Brian for 4 years. What she described wasn't surprising, but it was devastating. She told them about isolation disguised as concern, about Brian slowly turning her against friends and family by suggesting they didn't really care about her, about how he positioned himself as her only ally while quietly sabotaging her support system. She talked about infidelity, emotional and physical, and how Brian twisted every confrontation into proof that she was insecure, needy, unstable. During the divorce, he'd tried to paint her as mentally unwell to avoid financial responsibility. It was the same playbook, different setting, same tactics. Elena had receipts, screenshots, messages, emails, language eerily similar to the things Brian had written about me. But what made my blood run cold was what came next. Elena told Tom that Brian had been contacting people from my high school, asking about me, fishing for stories that could support his narrative. He claimed he was organizing a reunion, but the questions were pointed, leading. Was Fiona dramatic? Did she hold grudges? Did she cause trouble? Most people didn't bite. Some even told Elena they remembered Brian being cruel to me. A few admitted they'd felt sorry for me back then. Brian had been preparing. Tom was shaken. He started reaching out to people in his own life, friends from his softball league, coworkers, asking questions he'd never thought to ask before. One friend, Jake, finally spoke up. Jake told Tom he'd watched Brian target weaker players on the team. Constant criticism disguised as jokes, humiliation masked as team banter, stirring conflict between teammates by exaggerating private conversations. Others chimed in with similar observations. The picture became impossible to ignore. Brian wasn't misunderstood. He was consistent. When Tom and a few others went to the league organizers, Brian was asked to leave the team. That's when he escalated. The messages started coming more frequently, this time to me too. Accusations, threats, claims he'd sue me for defamation, rants about conspiracies and betrayal. I saved everything. Every text, every message, every screenshot. The hypervigilance I thought I'd outgrown came roaring back. I checked my locks twice before bed. I scanned parking lots. I jumped at unfamiliar notifications. Brian still had power, not because he was right, but because he refused to stop. And as the pressure built, one truth became impossible to deny. Staying quiet at the wedding wouldn't have protected anyone. It would have only delayed the inevitable. I didn't realize how exhausted I was until my body forced me to stop. It wasn't one dramatic breakdown. It was a slow unraveling, missed sleep, shallow breaths, the constant hum of anxiety sitting just beneath my skin like a low electrical current. The same feeling I'd lived with as a teenager, creeping back into my adult life without asking permission. I started double-checking my phone before bed, even when there were no new notifications. I replayed Brian's messages in my head, his words looping like they were trying to carve themselves into me. Some were angry, some were mocking. A few were calm in a way that scared me more than the rage, like he was trying to sound reasonable while threatening consequences. I hadn't responded to a single one. Still, it felt like he was everywhere. At school, I smiled for my students and corrected math worksheets, but my focus slipped. A loud noise in the hallway made my heart jump. A parent raising their voice during pickup made my stomach knot. I caught myself scanning faces in the parking lot after work, measuring distances, calculating exits. Jake noticed. "You're not sleeping," he said one night, gently, as we lay in bed with the lights off. "You keep waking up." I turned toward the wall. "I'm fine." It was a lie, a familiar one. The lowest point came a few days later, in the most ordinary moment. I was standing in the grocery store staring at a shelf of pasta sauce when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Just a vibration, no sound. I froze. My hands started shaking so badly I had to grip the cart to steady myself. For a split second, I was 16 again, cornered in a hallway, waiting for something bad to happen because it always did. I abandoned the cart and walked out. I sat in my car with the engine off, tears blurring my vision, and finally admitted what I'd been avoiding. I was scared, not just of Brian, of how much power he still had over my nervous system, of how easily the past had swallowed the present. That night, I broke down in front of Jake. "I should have stayed quiet," I said, the words tumbling out between sobs. "If I'd just kept my mouth shut, none of this would be happening. Lizzie wouldn't be dealing with this. Tom wouldn't have lost friends. Elena wouldn't be dragged back into his mess." Jake held me while I cried, his arms firm around my shoulders. "Brian is responsible for Brian," he said quietly. "Not you." It sounded logical, reasonable. I didn't feel it. The guilt was heavier than logic, the idea that my voice, my truth, had set off a chain reaction that hurt people I loved, felt unbearable. I started imagining alternative versions of the wedding night. Me smiling politely. Me dancing once and leaving early. Me swallowing everything like I always had. Maybe then everyone would be fine. Except I wouldn't. The messages kept coming. Elena filed for a restraining order first. She told me she couldn't live like this anymore, that she recognized the pattern too well to ignore it again. Hearing her say that stirred something in me, but fear still outweighed resolve. I wasn't sure I was strong enough to do the same. The night before I decided, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to Jake's breathing, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Every memory from high school felt closer than the ones from last week. My chest ached with the weight of it all. At around 3 a.m., I sat up. I thought about my students, about the quiet ones who lingered after class, about the way they watched adults, searching for safety cues. What would I tell them? Would I tell them to stay silent, to keep the peace? Would I tell them their fear mattered less than other people's comfort? The answer came quietly but firmly. No. By morning, I was hollowed out, but clear. I gathered every screenshot, every message, every timestamp. I printed them out, my hands steadier than I expected. Elena helped me organize everything, walking me through the process like someone who'd been here before and survived it. When I walked into the courthouse to file for a restraining order, my legs felt weak, but my spine didn't. Brian had taken enough from me already. I wasn't giving him my silence, too. Walking into the courthouse felt nothing like the movies. There was no dramatic music, no clear sense of justice waiting on the other side of a door, just fluorescent lights, scuffed floors, and people moving through metal detectors with the quiet efficiency of a place that had seen everything. Still, my hands shook as I handed over my paperwork. The clerk was calm, professional, kind in a way that didn't feel performative. She explained the process, told me what would happen next, and answered my questions without rushing me. When she said, "We'll schedule a hearing," something in my chest tightened. Not with fear this time, but with resolve. I wasn't hiding anymore. Brian's reaction was immediate and predictable. Within hours of being served, he exploded online. Long posts, vague enough to avoid names, specific enough that anyone who knew the situation understood exactly who he was talking about. He painted himself as the victim of a coordinated attack by vindictive women who couldn't handle successful men. He accused us of lies, manipulation, and obsession. It backfired. People who knew him professionally saw the posts and grew uncomfortable. The tone was aggressive, defensive, unhinged. A few mutual acquaintances reached out to ask what was going on, not to accuse, but to check in. For the first time, the narrative wasn't entirely his. The hearings were scheduled close together. Elena's first, then mine, 2 days later. She went before me, composed and steady, laying out her evidence with the confidence of someone who'd learned that clarity was power. Brian represented himself. That alone told me a lot. He interrupted the judge, dismissed messages as venting, claimed Elena was exaggerating. The judge read his words aloud in court, stripping them of context and excuses. Hearing them spoken like that, cold, factual, made their weight undeniable. Elena was granted a 1-year restraining order. Watching her walk out of that courtroom lighter than she'd gone in did something to me. It reframed fear into possibility. When it was my turn, I was still nervous, but no longer unsure. I presented my evidence. The messages, the attempts to gather information about me from old classmates, the timeline starting at the wedding and escalating steadily afterward. I spoke clearly, even when my voice wavered. Brian's defense was what I expected. He claimed I was obsessed with him, that I'd caused drama at the wedding out of jealousy, that I'd initiated contact. The judge asked him a simple question. Then why were you contacting her former classmates? He didn't have an answer that made sense. He grew defensive, his tone sharpened, the mask slipped. And in that moment, I felt it. The shift, the power moving away from him. The judge granted the restraining order. 1 year. No contact, no posts, no indirect communication. As we left the courtroom, Brian tried to approach me in the parking lot, still arguing, still demanding to be heard. Tom stepped between us and reminded him, calmly, that he was now legally prohibited from speaking to me. Brian stormed off. That was the last time I saw him. A few weeks later, his employer put him on administrative leave. His public behavior had raised concerns. Clients were uncomfortable. The company didn't want the liability. Then came the termination. Brian moved back to our hometown to live with his parents. His social media went quiet. His name stopped coming up in conversations. The silence felt unreal at first, like the calm after a storm when you're still waiting for thunder. But days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened. I started sleeping again. I walked to my car without scanning every shadow. I stopped flinching at notifications. The quiet became something I could trust. Standing up had consequences, yes, but so did staying silent. And for the first time, the consequences weren't mine alone to carry. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in quiet updates, half sentences, news delivered carefully, like people were afraid saying Brian's name too loudly might pull him back into the room. Tom told us first. Brian's termination had spread through their social circle faster than expected. Some people were shocked. Others said nothing at all, silence that felt more like confirmation than confusion. A few mutual friends quietly distanced themselves, deleting old photos, declining invitations, choosing absence over confrontation. Not everyone believed the truth. There were still people who clung to Brian's version of events, people who preferred the idea of vindictive women over the discomfort of admitting they'd misjudged someone. Those people drifted away from Tom and Lizzie's lives naturally, without a fight. And that more than anything changed the shape of their marriage. Tom lost a best friend and part of his social circle in the same breath. It wasn't easy. He grieved, not just Brian, but the version of himself who hadn't seen the signs sooner. Lizzie told me there were nights when he sat quietly on the couch, staring at nothing, trying to reconcile loyalty with reality. But something stronger replaced the loss: clarity. Tom became fiercely protective of his boundaries. He stopped excusing behavior that made him uncomfortable. He apologized, to me, to Elena, to Lizzie, for the moments he'd doubted, minimized, or hesitated. Watching that growth felt like closure I hadn't known I needed. Elena, too, began to breathe again. With the restraining order in place, she stopped checking her phone every few minutes. She started dating someone new, a man who treated her with consistency instead of control. She laughed more, slept better. When she talked about the future, it didn't sound like survival anymore. As for Brian, the consequences kept stacking, quietly, relentlessly. His restraining orders became public record. Potential employers hesitated. Background checks raised questions he couldn't easily explain away. He found temporary work with his uncle's construction company, far from the career he'd once bragged about. The world didn't punish him out of revenge. It simply stopped protecting him. People from high school started reaching out. Private messages, tentative at first. 2 women told me they'd been bullied by Brian during different years, one after I graduated, one even earlier, in middle school. A former coworker contacted me anonymously to say Brian had created a hostile work environment for female employees and had only been shielded because he was good at sales. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. It was validating. It was heartbreaking. I thought about how many people Brian had hurt because institutions had failed to hold him accountable early. Teachers, administrators, employers, all of them had chosen convenience over confrontation at some point. And I wondered how different things might have been if someone had stepped in when we were 16. For me, the aftermath was quieter, but deeper. I went weeks without mentioning Brian at all. His name lost its power. The restraining order sat in a folder I rarely opened. The fear that had once lived in my muscles slowly loosened its grip. One afternoon, while walking my students to the playground, I realized something startling. I felt normal. Not braced, not scanning, not shrinking. Just present. Jake noticed it too. "You seem lighter," he said one night as we washed dishes together. I was. The wedding that had once felt like a breaking point became something else in my memory. Not a failure, not a mistake. A line. Before, I had survived by staying quiet. After, I lived by speaking when it mattered. Tom and Lizzie eventually told me they were planning a small vow renewal for their first anniversary. Something intimate, surrounded only by people who truly supported them. Lizzie joked that this time she'd personally approve every guest list. We laughed. It felt earned. The chaos Brian unleashed didn't destroy us. It revealed us. And when the dust settled, what remained was smaller, but stronger. Cleaner. Honest. It's been months now. Long enough that the sharp edges of everything have dulled. Long enough that Brian feels less like a presence in my life, and more like a chapter that's finally been closed and shelved where it belongs. The restraining order is still in effect. He hasn't violated it. His social media remains quiet, his world smaller than it used to be. I don't track him. I don't wonder what he's doing. I don't need updates to move forward. Peace doesn't require curiosity. What surprised me most wasn't how things ended, but how I felt afterward. I thought I would be overwhelmed with guilt, that I'd lie awake wondering if I'd ruined my cousin's wedding, strained her marriage, or caused more damage than good by speaking up. I didn't, because clarity replaced guilt. Lizzie and I talk often. Her marriage is steady, built on honesty instead of denial. Tom is different now, more aware, less defensive, quicker to listen. He learned the hard way that loyalty without accountability can become complicity. Elena is thriving. Jake and I are stronger, and I am no longer carrying the weight of a story I was never responsible for fixing alone. I still think about high school sometimes, not with anger, but with distance. I think about the girl I was, swallowing her fear to keep the peace. I wish I could tell her that one day she would stand in a room full of adults and refuse to be rewritten. That silence is not the same thing as strength. And that discomfort is not a reason to doubt your own reality. To anyone listening to this story, especially if you've ever run into someone who hurt you and acted like nothing happened, here's what I've learned. You are not obligated to protect someone else's comfort at the expense of your truth. Speaking up doesn't always lead to immediate peace. Sometimes it leads to chaos first. But chaos has a way of exposing what's already broken and making room for something better. I didn't ruin a wedding. I ended a lie. And for the first time since I was 16, I'm not waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm just living my life, quietly, fully, unapologetically.